The fire crackled like a dying beast, spitting embers into the night air as we huddled closer, our faces bathed in its flickering orange glow. The woods around us were a cathedral of shadows, the kind of dark that didn't just swallow light. It chewed it up and spat it back out as something colder, meaner. My friends were halfway through their third bag of marshmallows, the sugary stench mixing with the pine-scented breeze, when Jake dropped his voice to a gravelly whisper. Normally, he was the guy who'd crack a beer and a joke in the same breath, his laughter loud enough to scare off any ghost worth its salt. But tonight, his foot tapped a nervous rhythm against the dirt, and his eyes, usually bright with mischief, were sunken, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. "Listen," he said, his voice slicing through the chatter like a rusty blade. "This isn't some campfire bullshit. This is real. Happened on my mission. LDS stuff, you know, out near the reservation." That word alone carried weight out here, a sprawling stretch of land where the rules of the world seemed to bend, where the air tasted of dust and secrets. I'd heard the stories, skinwalkers, whispers in the dark, things that didn't belong, but I always figured they were just tales to keep kids from wandering too far. Jake, though, he wasn't the type to spin yarn. He was the guy who'd once wrestled a drunk raccoon out of our tent and laughed about it later. If he was spooked, it wasn't a game. He leaned forward, the firelight carving deep shadows into his face, making him look 10 years older. We were out there, me and Elder Pratt, my companion. Big guy, snored like a chainsaw, but steady, you know. We'd been knocking doors all day, spreading the word to some new folks on the edge of the res. Nice people, offered us water and fry bread. Nothing weird. But then we ran out of gas. A collective groan rose from the group. "Classic," muttered Sarah, rolling her eyes as she skewered another marshmallow. "What's next? A flat tire and a creepy hitchhiker." Jake shot her a look that could have curdled milk. "Laugh if you want, but it's not funny when you're stuck in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal and the sun's bleeding out of the sky." We sat there, engine dead, just waiting. The res out there, it's not like here. No street lights, no houses for miles, just dirt and scrub, and this feeling like the land's watching you, waiting for you to blink. I shifted on my log, the bark digging into my thighs. The air had turned sharper, carrying a faint metallic tang, like blood, or maybe rust. The wood seemed to lean in, branches creaking as if they were eavesdropping. Jake's story wasn't new to me in concept. Missionaries getting stranded wasn't exactly rare, but the way his hands trembled as he gripped his knees told me this wasn't just a tale of inconvenience. "Some old guy came by eventually," he continued, dragging a gas can like it was the Holy Grail. Didn't say much, just filled us up and shuffled off into the dusk. By then, it was dark, real dark. The kind where you can't tell if your eyes are open or shut. Pratt fell asleep in the passenger seat, head lolling like a rag doll. I was driving, pushing the speed limit, because I just wanted us home. Figured the worst I'd hit was a deer. He paused, staring into the fire like it held the answers he couldn't find back then. The flames danced, casting jagged shadows across his face, and for a second, I swore I saw something move in the trees behind him. A flicker, too quick to pin down. My skin prickled, but I chalked it up to the cold. Or maybe the story was getting to me more than I wanted to admit. "Then I saw it," Jake said, his voice dropping so low I had to strain to hear. Movement, right at the edge of the headlights. Thought it was a coyote at first. Those sneaky bastards are everywhere out there. But it kept pace with us, darting just outside the beam. I pushed the gas harder, 40, 45 miles an hour, and it didn't fall back. Whatever it was close, too close. Sarah snorted, but it was weaker this time, her bravado cracking. What? You're saying a coyote ran a 5K next to your car? Maybe it was training for the Olympics. Shut up, Sarah, I snapped, surprising myself. Her smirk faltered, and she sank back into her jacket. Jake didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on some invisible point in the dark, like he was reliving every second. I looked down, he said, and that's when I saw them. Not 1, 6 or 7. Human shapes, but wrong. They were on all fours, sprinting like wolves, keeping up with me at 40 goddamn miles an hour. I slammed the brakes so hard Pratt nearly ate the dashboard. He woke up yelling, "What the hell, man?" But all I could say was, "Pray, right now." The fire popped, a loud snap that made us all jump. I could smell the smoke now, thick and acrid, curling into my lungs like it wanted to choke me. The woods were silent, no crickets, no owls, just the hiss of burning wood and the thud of my own pulse. Jake's words hung in the air, heavy as the night pressing down on us. "They weren't animals," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw their hands, fingers, not paws, digging into the dirt as they ran. Their heads twisted toward me, and their eyes. Jesus, their eyes glowed like headlights reflecting off a road sign. Bright, unnatural. I floored it again, didn't care if we crashed. Pratt was freaking out, asking what I saw, but I couldn't talk. If I opened my mouth, I felt like they'd hear me, like they'd know. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The image he painted was too vivid. A pack of things, human but not, galloping alongside a car, their eyes cutting through the dark like knives. It was absurd, but the way Jake's hand shook, the way his voice cracked, made it real, too real. We made it back to the apartment, he said, but I couldn't sleep, kept seeing them in my head, those shapes pounding the pavement, matching my speed like it was nothing. Pratt thought I was nuts, kept saying it was just shadows or exhaustion, but I know what I saw, and that was just the start. He stopped, letting the silence stretch. The fire was dying now, embers glowing like the eyes he'd described, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The woods around us didn't feel like a cozy campsite anymore. They felt alive, predatory, waiting for us to let our guard down. I glanced at the others. Sarah was pale, her marshmallow forgotten on its stick. Tom, the quiet one, stared into the dark with wide, unblinking eyes. And Lisa, usually the skeptic, hugged her knees like a kid scared of the boogeyman. "What do you mean, the start?" I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. I didn't want to know, but I had to. Jake's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that didn't reach his eyes, dark humor creeping in despite the terror. "Oh, you think that was the punchline?" he said, his tone dripping with bitter amusement. "That was just the warm-up act. The res didn't let me go that easy. They came back." The air thickened, the scent of pine and smoke turning sour, like something rotting just out of sight. Jake leaned back, his silhouette merging with the shadows, and I could have sworn the trees behind him shifted, branches bending like fingers reaching for us. My imagination, probably. But out here, with his story sinking into my bones, imagination felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. "A few weeks later," he said, "they transferred me to a little town right on the res border. Me and a new companion, Elder Hayes, fresh-faced kid, thought he'd save the world one pamphlet at a time. We got stuck in this beat-up trailer, the kind that rattles when the wind blows. First night, I'm lying there trying to ignore the creaks when it starts, thumping. Loud, steady, like someone's hammering the door with a fist. He mimicked the sound, slapping his palm against his thigh. Thump, thump, thump. Each hit made my chest tighten, the rhythm echoing in the stillness. Hayes bolts up. Oh, who's that? Like it's the pizza guy at 2 a.m. I flick on the porch light, crack the door, just a sliver, and there's nothing. No one. Just the dark staring back, thick as tar. I could picture it. The flickering bulb, the empty porch, the night pressing against the trailer like a living thing. My hands were clammy now, the log beneath me suddenly too cold, too hard. Jake's story wasn't just creepy. It was burrowing into me, making me feel the weight of that darkness he'd faced. We step outside, he went on, and I'm sweeping the flashlight around, thinking maybe it's a drunk local or a stray dog. But the light doesn't catch anything, just dirt and shadows. Hayes is behind me, spooked, but trying to play tough. Then it hits again, thump, thump, from the other side of the trailer. Like whatever it is, it's circling us, playing with us. Circling, Tom broke in, his voice a shaky whisper. Like hunting. Jake's grin was sharp, a flash of teeth in the firelight. Yeah, Tom, like hunting. Except hunters don't knock first, they just take you. This thing, it wanted us to know it was there. The words landed like a punch. I could hear it in my head, the thumping, relentless, mocking. The trailer, a tin can in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a night that didn't care if you screamed. My mouth tasted like ash, the campfire smoke turning bitter on my tongue. We go back inside, Jake said. Lock everything. Turn on every light like that's gonna save us. But it keeps going. Thump, 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 moving around the walls. I peek out the window, and that's when I see them again. Shapes, tall ones, hunched ones, slipping in and out of the dark. Standing upright 1 second, dropping to all fours the next. My heart's hammering so hard I think it's gonna bust out of my chest. They're the same ones from the road, I know it. Same damn eyes, glowing like they're lit from inside. Lisa let out a small, choked sound, and I couldn't blame her. The image was too much. Those things, whatever they were, stalking the trailer, their eyes piercing the night. I could smell my own sweat now, sharp and sour, mixing with the damp earth beneath us. The woods felt tighter, the trees closer than they'd been 10 minutes ago. Hayes is praying like a madman, Jake said, and I'm just frozen. Then the footprints show up the next morning, circle the trailer, some human, some not. Too big, too spaced out, like they're mocking us with every step. We didn't stick around to ask questions, packed up and hauled us out of there. He stopped again, letting the story sink in. The fire was a pitiful glow now, barely holding back the dark. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the rustle of leaves overhead sounded too much like footsteps, soft, deliberate, closing in. Jake's face was half lit, half shadowed, and for a second, I wondered if he was still the same guy I'd known, or if something out there had taken a piece of him and left this haunted shell behind. That's not even the worst part, he said, his voice low and jagged. A couple days later, we're driving some church lady home. Lives out by the forest edge. She's chattering away, all cheerful, when she goes quiet. Leans forward, grabs my shoulder, and whispers, "Slow down." I ease off the gas, confused, and she points out the window. There's this thing, crouched between two trees, long limbs bent all wrong, watching us. She starts muttering about legends, stuff I'd never heard before, stuff I didn't want to hear. "Just go," she says, and I don't argue. The fire sputtered, a dying gasp, and the cold rushed in like it had been waiting for its chance. I could taste it now, fear, sharp and metallic, coating my tongue. Jake's story wasn't just a recounting. It was a warning, a crack in the world I thought I knew. Those things he'd seen, whatever they were, didn't belong in any reality I could accept. And yet, the way his voice trembled, the way his eyes darted to the shadows, made me believe every word. We dropped her off, he said, and when we got out to stretch, there's dirt smeared on the car, handprints, but the fingers are too long, too twisted. I'm telling you, they were following us, stalking us. Every night after that, I'd hear them. Whistles in the dark, sharp and shrill, like they were calling me back. I'd wake up to claw marks on the fence, footprints that didn't make sense. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me to know they could take me any time. The woods erupted in a sudden gust, branches snapping like brittle bones, and I nearly leapt off my log. Sarah yelped, dropping her stick into the dirt, and Tom's face was a mask of pure terror. Lisa was muttering something under her breath. Prayers, maybe, or curses. Jake just sat there, staring into the embers, his grin gone, replaced by a hollow look that made my stomach lurch. They're still out there, he said, so quiet I almost missed it. Every time I drive those roads, I feel them, watching, waiting. You think I'm crazy? Fine. But next time you're out in the dark, listen. Really listen. 'Cause they're not done with me, and they might not be done with you either. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint hiss of the wind through the trees. I wanted to laugh, to break the spell, but my throat was too tight. The air smelled wrong now, rotten, like something dead had crawled up from the earth and was breathing down our necks. I glanced at the shadows, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back. Nothing. Yet. Jake stood abruptly, brushing dirt off his jeans. I'm turning in, he said, his voice flat. You guys enjoy your marshmallows. He walked off toward the tents, his silhouette swallowed by the dark, leaving us sitting there stunned and shivering. I looked at the others, their faces pale in the dying firelight. Sarah forced a laugh, but it sounded like a sob. Well, that was a mood killer. Who's got the next story? Something with less freaky demon people? No one answered. The woods pressed in closer, the shadows thicker, the silence louder. I could still hear Jake's thumping in my head. Thump, 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 like it was echoing through the trees, calling something closer. My hands shook as I grabbed a stick to poke the fire, but the embers barely flickered. The night had taken over, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. Somewhere out there, beyond the circle of light, I swore I heard a whistle. Sharp, shrill, cutting through the dark like a promise. And then, just for a second, the bushes rustled. Not the wind, not an animal, something else. The fire's last embers winked out, leaving us in a shroud of darkness that felt too heavy, too alive, as Jake's final words hung in the air like a curse. They're still out there waiting. The woods around us seemed to tighten, branches creaking like old bones, the silence a predator stalking us from the shadows. His story of those twisted sprinting shapes on the reservation roads, human but not, their glowing eyes cutting through the night, left a chill that no blanket could warm, a dread that sank into my bones and refused to let go. But that's the thing about the dark, isn't it? It doesn't just hide monsters in one corner of the world. It stretches its claws everywhere, from the desolate backroads of the LDS lands to places closer than you'd think. And trust me, what's coming next will make you question every late-night drive you've ever taken. Picture this: a quiet suburb in Phoenix, Arizona, where the streets lie empty under the hum of flickering streetlights, and the desert whispers secrets you don't want to hear. Our next tale isn't about missionaries or reservations. It's about a lone driver, a guy like you or me, who thought the night was his friend until it showed him its teeth. Before we dive into the shadows of those Phoenix roads, let me just say, if this kind of bone-chilling madness keeps you up at night like it does me, hit that subscribe button and join the Sleepless Souls of No Sleep Nightmares Reddit. Drop a comment below. Tell us if you've ever felt something watching you from the dark. Your stories keep this nightmare alive, and I can't wait to hear them. Now buckle up, because the night's about to get a whole lot darker. The dashboard clock glowed a sickly green, its digits screaming 3:17 a.m. as I gripped the steering wheel, the leather slick under my palms from a nervous sweat I couldn't shake. The streets of this Phoenix suburb stretched out before me like veins in a corpse. Empty, lifeless, bathed in the sodium orange hum of streetlights that buzzed like dying flies. The air streaming through my cracked window was dry as bone dust, carrying the faint tang of desert sage and something sour I couldn't place. Maybe the stench of my own paranoia. I'd always loved these late-night drives, the way the world hushed itself into a rare silence, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and my thoughts. But tonight, that silence felt wrong, predatory, like it was holding its breath for something to lunge. I'd been at it for hours, looping through the same grid of cul-de-sacs and strip malls, the tires whispering against asphalt so worn it gleamed like polished obsidian. My roommate Dave called it my midnight therapy, a way to unwind after the grind of a double shift at the diner, where the grease clung to my skin like a second shadow. Dave was the loud one, the guy who'd turn a quiet night into a circus with his dumb jokes and endless chatter. Me, I was the quiet one, the guy who'd rather listen to the desert than another one of his rants about UFOs or whatever conspiracy he'd dug up on Reddit. But tonight, I was alone, and the quiet wasn't soothing. It was suffocating. The first sign came as I rolled past an empty lot, the kind where tumbleweeds piled up like forgotten promises. Something darted at the edge of my headlights, a flicker of black against the grey-brown dirt. I squinted, figuring it was a stray dog or one of those mangy coyotes that prowled the outskirts. But it moved too fast, too deliberate, cutting across the road in a blur that left my heart thudding against my ribs. I eased off the gas, the engine's growl dropping to a low purr, and leaned forward, peering into the dark. Nothing, just the wind kicking up dust, swirling it into ghostly shapes that dissolved as quick as they formed. Probably nothing, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding thin and hollow in the cab. I cranked the radio, hoping some late-night DJ's gravelly drawl would drown out the unease creeping up my spine. Static hissed back at me, the signal fading into a white noise snarl that made my teeth ache. I slapped the dial off, the silence rushing back like a flood, and that's when I saw it again. Closer this time, right at the passenger window. I slammed the brakes, the truck lurching hard enough to throw me against the seatbelt. My breath caught, sharp and ragged, as I stared out the glass. There it was, a shape, black as tar, hunched low and scuttling on all fours. Long limbs stretched out like spider legs, moving with a jerky precision that wasn't animal, wasn't human. My headlights caught it for a split second, and I saw the face, stark white, smooth as porcelain, featureless except for two hollow pits where eyes should have been. No mouth, no nose, just that blank staring mask. glowing against the pitch-black body like a skull floating in the void. "Jesus," I hissed, my voice cracking as I fumbled for the door lock, my fingers slipping on the button. The thing froze, head twisting toward me with a snap that echoed in the still air, like a neck breaking clean in two. My stomach churned, bile rising hot and bitter in my throat. I floored the gas, tires squealing as the truck shot forward, the white face vanishing into the dark as quick as it had come. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the engine's roar, and I didn't stop until I hit a main road, the neon glow of a gas station spilling over me like a lifeline. I pulled into the lot, hands shaking so bad I could barely shift into park. The air smelled of gasoline and burnt rubber, and I sucked it in, trying to steady myself. My reflection stared back from the window, wide-eyed, pale, looking like I'd aged a decade in 10 seconds. "Get it together," I told myself, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a sob. Probably just some freak in a Halloween mask, right? Phoenix's own discount Grim Reaper. But the humor fell flat, souring in my mouth as I replayed that face in my head. No mask moved like that. No person could sprint on all fours at that speed, matching a truck going 30 miles an hour. I sat there, engine idling, until the clerk inside started giving me the stink eye through the glass. I didn't care. I wasn't moving until my heart stopped trying to claw its way out of my chest. That should have been the end of it. A one-off scare to laugh about later with Dave over cheap beer. But the desert doesn't let go that easy. A few weeks later, I was back on those roads. Same time, same routine. Only this time, Dave was riding shotgun. He'd begged to come along, claiming he was bored out of his skull and needed an adventure. I should have said no. Should have known the night wasn't done with me. We were cruising past a row of skeletal mesquite trees, their branches clawing at the sky like they wanted to tear it down, when Dave pointed ahead. "What's that?" he said, his voice too loud, too casual for the hour. I followed his finger and saw it, a lump in a tree up ahead, perched like a vulture waiting for roadkill. At first, I thought it was a trash bag caught in the wind, but then it moved, unfolding itself with a grace that made my skin crawl. "Slow down," Dave said, leaning forward, his breath fogging the windshield. I didn't want to, but my foot eased off the gas anyway, the truck rolling to a crawl. The thing clambered down the trunk, fast, too fast, its black body blending with the shadows until it hit the ground. That white face flashed again, locking onto us, and Dave's bravado melted into a high-pitched, "Nope, nope, nope." He grabbed my arm, his nails digging in hard enough to bruise. "Turn around," he yelled, his voice cracking like a teenager's. I didn't need telling twice. I yanked the wheel, the truck fishtailing as I gunned it back the way we'd come. The rearview mirror showed that thing bounding across the road, spinning to face us with that same blank stare. My headlights caught it full on for a heartbeat, long enough to see it wasn't running anymore, just standing there, head tilted like it was curious, like it was memorizing us. "Floor it," Dave screamed, and I did, the engine roaring as we tore through the night. The radio blared to life on its own, static and garbled voices, some preacher yelling about damnation, and I punched it off, my knuckles white. The smell of burnt oil filled the cab, sharp and choking, and I couldn't tell if it was the truck or my own fear frying my senses. We didn't stop until we hit our street, the truck screeching into the driveway like a hunted animal. Dave bolted out before I'd even killed the engine, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. I followed, legs wobbly, the night air tasting like metal and dust. Inside, he paced the living room, ranting about freaking cryptids and "Why didn't you tell me Phoenix was cursed?" I just sank onto the couch, staring at the wall. That white face burned into my retinas like a brand. Could have been worse, I said, forcing a grin that felt like a grimace. At least it didn't ask for a ride. Imagine that thing shotgun, critiquing my playlist. Dave stopped pacing, glaring at me like I'd lost it. Not funny, man. That thing's probably out there right now, plotting how to peel our faces off and wear them like party masks. He wasn't wrong to worry. The next time it showed up, I was alone again, coming off a late shift. The diner's neon sign flickered goodbye as I pulled onto the road, the night thick with that same oppressive quiet. I'd avoided that stretch by the empty field since the first sighting, but exhaustion dulled my caution, and I took the shortcut without thinking. Big mistake. Halfway through, the headlights dimmed, like something sucked the power right out of them, and the engine coughed, stuttering like a dying man's last breath. I cursed, smacking the dashboard, when movement flickered in the rearview mirror. My blood turned to ice. It was back there, loping along at a distance, that white face glowing like a lantern in the dark. I floored it, the truck wheezing as it struggled to obey, but the thing didn't fall back. It sped up, closing the gap with a speed that defied physics. The air in the cab grew heavy, reeking of wet fur and something rancid, like meat left out too long. I could hear it now, a low, guttural hum, not quite a growl, vibrating through the glass. My hands shook so bad, I nearly veered off the road, the tires skidding on the loose gravel. In the mirror, it was closer, close enough to see its head tilt, those hollow eyes boring into me like they could see my soul and didn't like what they found. I don't know how I made it home. The truck sputtered into the driveway, and I stumbled out, keys jingling like a death knell as I fumbled the lock. Inside, I slammed the door, leaning against it as my breath rasped in my chest. The hum stopped, but I didn't dare look out the window. Not then, not for hours. When I finally did, the street was empty, the night mocking me with its stillness. Dave was awake when I staggered in, sprawled on the couch with a beer and some late-night infomercial droning in the background. He took one look at my face and sat up, the can clattering to the floor. "It's back, isn't it?" he said, his voice tight. "Yeah," I croaked, collapsing beside him. "And it's not just watching anymore, it's hunting." He didn't laugh this time. No jokes, no bravado, just a slow nod, like he'd known it was coming. "We're screwed, aren't we?" he said, his tone flat, almost resigned. "Probably," I replied, managing a weak smirk. "But hey, if it eats us, at least we won't have to pay rent next month." The dark humor didn't land, not really, but it was all I had left. The next night, Dave dragged me outside at 4 a.m., flashlight in hand, insisting we hunt the bastard down. I thought he'd lost it, but the wild look in his eyes said he was serious. We prowled the neighborhood, adrenaline pumping, the beam slicing through the dark like a blade. That's when we saw it, perched on a swing set, head craned toward us, that white face glowing under a single street lamp. We froze, the air thick with the stench of decay and something electric, like a storm about to break. It dropped to the ground, fluid and silent, and vanished behind a fence before we could blink. The flashlight beam trembled in Dave's hand, and I could hear his breath hitching, a sound too close to a whimper. "Still think we can take it?" I whispered, my voice dripping with sarcasm I didn't feel. "Shut up," he hissed, but there was no fight in it. We bolted back home, hearts pounding, the night swallowing our courage whole. After that, Dave stopped talking about it. Wouldn't even look at me when I brought it up. He'd seen what I'd seen, and it had broken something in him. The loudmouth reduced to a shadow of himself. Me? I kept driving, couldn't stop. Every night, I'd hit those roads, waiting for it to show up again, that white face taunting me from the dark. It became a game, a sick, twisted dance between me and whatever it was. The desert knew my name now, and it wasn't letting go. I'd smell it sometimes, that rot creeping into the cab, hear its hum rattling the windows, and every time, I'd push the gas harder, daring it to catch me, knowing one night it just might. The streets of Phoenix aren't safe anymore. Not for me, not for anyone who listens too close to the silence. That thing's out there waiting, its blank stare promising something worse than death. And the worst part? I can't tell if I'm running from it or toward it. The truck's engine faded into a distant growl as I locked the door behind me. Dave's last words, "It's hunting," echoing in my skull like a death knell. That white-faced thing, its blank stare searing through the Phoenix night, didn't just haunt those streets. It clawed its way into my mind, turning every shadow into a threat, every rustle into a promise of something worse. The desert had shown its true face, a mask of silence hiding a predator that didn't need to explain itself, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with us, or with anyone foolish enough to wander its roads after dark. But if you think the terror stops at the edge of Arizona, you're dead wrong. The night has a way of stretching its tendrils far beyond one cursed place, reaching into corners of the world where the air itself feels like it's lying to you. Let's shift gears, literally, down to a remote stretch of Kikapoo land in Mexico, where the mountains don't just watch, they hunger. Our next story trades the asphalt of Phoenix for a dusty sprawl at the foot of ancient peaks, a place where family ties and old houses hide secrets that make that white-faced stalker seem like a friendly neighbor. Before we step into that suffocating heat and those whispering shadows, I've got a quick favor to ask. If these tales are sinking their hooks into you, smash that subscribe button and join the No Sleep Nightmares Reddit crew. We're all in this sleepless hell together. And hey, leave a comment. Have you ever seen something out there that didn't belong? Your nightmares fuel ours, so let's keep the terror rolling. Ready? Let's plunge into the dark heart of Kikapoo country, where the night doesn't just scare you, it claims you. The truck rattled to a stop, its engine coughing out a final groan as dust swirled around us like a swarm of restless spirits, gritty and relentless, stinging my eyes as it clawed its way into every crevice of my clothes. I stepped out, my sneakers sinking into the dry, cracked earth with a soft crunch, and the heat slammed into me like a fist, thick, suffocating, a brutal wave laced with the sharp tang of sun-scorched sage and something faintly rancid, like meat left to fester in the shadows of this forsaken place. The sky was a bruised orange, the sun bleeding into the horizon behind the jagged peaks of the mountain range that loomed over Tanner's land, casting long, twisted shadows that writhed across the dirt like skeletal fingers reaching for something they'd never grasp. Those mountains weren't just big. They were ancient, brooding, their slopes draped in a haze that seemed to hum with a low, ominous pulse, a sound you couldn't hear but felt deep in your bones, vibrating through your marrow like a warning carved in stone. My grandmother, Tana, always said they could unravel your mind if you strayed too far without the right words to guard your soul. Her voice low and grave, eyes glinting with a knowing I'd never understood. At 8 or 9, I'd smirked at her warnings, chalking them up to old Kikapoo superstitions meant to scare kids into obedience. But standing there now, with the dusk clawing its way across the land, that smirk felt like a distant memory, a flimsy shield against the weight of this place. Tana's property sprawled at the foot of those peaks, a patchwork of scrub and dirt that stretched into the dark like a promise or a threat, its edges blurring into the night as if the land itself refused to be contained. The old house squatted ahead, a hulking silhouette against the fading light, its metal-barred windows sealed tight like the eyes of a corpse, unblinking and cold. The steel doors groaned as my parents, Nita and Atohi, wrestled them open, the sound a harsh grind like bones scraping together, echoing in the still air with a menace that made my skin prickle. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and mildew, a cloying thickness that coated my throat as I breathed it in. The walls were stained with years of neglect, dark streaks running like tears down the plaster, and the floorboards sagged underfoot, creaking with every step like they were whispering complaints. My sisters, Amma and Winona, darted in behind them, their laughter a thin, brittle thread against the oppressive quiet that pressed down like a physical weight, a silence so dense it seemed to muffle their voices before they could fully escape. The new house sat a short distance away, its bars less severe, its windows daring to crack open and let in the heat. A taunt dressed up as a blessing, as if the land was daring us to test its mercy. Aunt Winona and Uncle Snay had claimed it with their kids, Hosa and Lona, while cousins Chido and Saya roamed somewhere out there, their voices swallowed by the night as they helped Tana with the endless tasks or prepped for the ceremonies that kept this land tethered to our blood. Rituals I'd never questioned until now, their chants echoing in my head like a half-remembered nightmare. Night crashed down fast, a black curtain slamming shut with no streetlights to fend it off, a darkness so complete it felt like it had teeth. The only light came from our truck's headlights, slicing through the void like a desperate scream, their beams trembling as they caught on the gnarled branches of the scrub, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters across the ground. If we managed to coax a campfire to life, its faint, flickering glow was a pitiful defiance against the dark, a trembling heartbeat in a world that seemed to have stopped breathing. Without it, the night was absolute, a living thing that pressed against your eyes, your lungs, your skin, until you couldn't tell where you ended and it began, a suffocating embrace that smelled of dry earth and something older, something sour that lingered just beneath the surface, teasing my nose with every shallow breath. I shuffled into the old house, the floorboards creaking under my weight with a groan that sounded too much like a plea, the air inside thick with trapped heat and the sour reek of old wood, a stench that clung to my clothes like a second skin. The windows were locked tight, bars cold and unyielding against my fingers as I brushed them, their metal biting into my flesh with a chill that didn't match the heat. I flopped onto a cot, its springs whining like a dying animal, a high-pitched squeal that grated on my nerves as I sank into the lumpy mattress. Amma and Winona giggled as they tossed a ragged pillow back and forth, their voices a fleeting shield against the silence, a sound so fragile it felt like it could shatter at any moment. The day's labor, hauling water under a relentless sun, dodging thorns that snagged at my skin, dragged me under, my eyelids heavy as lead, and I sank into a sleep that felt more like falling, a descent into a void where the dark waited with open jaws. Then it came, a scream, raw and jagged, tearing through the night like a knife through flesh, a sound so visceral it yanked me back from the edge of oblivion. My eyes flew open, heart slamming against my ribs with a force that made my chest ache as I jolted upright, sheets twisting around my legs like they wanted to hold me down, their damp fabric clinging to my skin with a clammy grip. It was Hosa, my little cousin from the new house. his voice a piercing wail that shredded the stillness and sent a shiver racing up my spine, sharp and cold as ice. I stumbled across the room, tripping over a tangle of socks and a toppled lantern that clattered to the floor with a hollow clang, my bare feet slapping the cold boards as I reached the window. The bars pressed into my face, sharp and unyielding, cutting into my cheeks as I peered out, the metal's chill seeping into my bones. The moon hung low, a sickly crescent spilling a thin, watery glow over the yard, enough to paint silhouettes of adults rushing around, flashlights swinging like panicked moths in the dark, their beams darting erratically as if searching for something they feared to find. My father's hulking frame filled the doorway, his voice a whip-crack cutting through the haze, sharp and commanding. "Stay put," he snapped, his eyes glinting with a mix of rage and something softer, something scared. A flicker I'd never seen in him before, a crack in the armor of the man who'd always been my rock. I'd never seen him like that, calm, steady a Tohi, reduced to a man on edge, and it tightened my chest like a noose, the air catching in my throat as I tried to swallow the panic rising there. Through the bars, I caught Aunt Winona flailing her arms, pointing toward the fence line with a wild desperation, her flashlight beam jerking wildly across the scrub, slicing through the dark like a blade. Uncle Snay and Cheeto prowled the yard, their lights stabbing into the shadows with a frantic precision, searching for something they couldn't name. Their movements tense and hurried, boots crunching on the dry earth with a sound that echoed in the stillness. The adults were rattled, really rattled, and that wasn't normal. If this was just Hosa's bad dream, why were they moving like the devil himself was breathing down their necks, his hot, fetid breath curling around their ears? I pressed my ear to the wall, the rough plaster cool against my skin, straining for any sound. Wind rustling the scrub, a distant owl's hoot, anything to ground me in something familiar. Nothing came, just a silence so thick it felt like it could choke me, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered every whisper of life. My sisters stirred, whispering questions I couldn't answer, their voices trembling as the night stretched on, each word quivering like a leaf in a storm. Exhaustion clawed at me again, a heavy hand dragging me back to the cot, my limbs leaden as I sank into the mattress, the echo of Hosa's scream lingering like a ghost in my skull, a sound that refused to fade, clawing at the edges of my mind as I slipped back into the dark. Morning crept in with a sluggish grey light, the heat already seeping through the walls, thick and sticky as it pressed against my skin. A damp weight that made every movement feel like wading through mud. I stumbled to the kitchen, my head pounding from a night of broken sleep, the air heavy with the smell of stale tortillas and burnt coffee. Lona was there, hunched over a plate, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his fingers trembling slightly as he tore off a piece of dough. I grabbed a tortilla, the greasy warmth turning sour in my grip as I leaned in, my voice rough, scraped raw by sleeplessness. "What the hell happened last night?" I demanded, the words spilling out sharper than I meant, a desperate edge cutting through them. He chewed slow, eyes flicking to the window, like he expected something to lunge through it, his gaze darting with a nervousness I'd never seen in him before. Hosa was by the window, new house, the open one. Said something brushed his face, soft, cold, like a dead hand. Woke up and saw her, an old lady, pale as a corpse, head shoved between the bars, long grey hair hanging down, almost touching him, smiling like she knew him, like she'd been waiting. He freaked, screamed, till his throat gave out, said her eyes were wrong, too big, too bright, like they glowed. I froze, tortilla dangling from my hand, the words sinking in like cold water down my spine, chilling me despite the heat. An old lady. Here. You're shitting me, I said, my voice cracking, disbelief warring with a creeping dread that tightened my throat. Loner shrugged, but his hands shook as he tore off another bite, the tortilla crumbling between his fingers. That's what he said. Kid's not a liar, you know Hosa. Doesn't spook easy. He's the one who chased that scorpion with a stick last summer, laughing the whole time. But he was shaking like a leaf, said, her smile stretched too wide, like her face didn't fit right. The tortilla hit the table with a soft thud, my appetite gone, replaced by a sour twist in my gut that made me want to gag. Hosa wasn't the type to cry wolf. He'd once laughed in the face of a tarantula crawling up his arm, daring it to bite, his grin wide and fearless. If he saw something, it wasn't just shadows playing tricks. It was real, sharp, cutting through the haze of childhood bravado. Out here, the dark could twist anything into a nightmare, but this felt too vivid, too close, a blade hovering just above my skin. I tracked down Cheeto later, finding him by the woodpile, his axe splitting logs with a wet crunch that echoed in the still air, a sound that reverberated in my chest like a heartbeat. Sweat dripped from his brow, staining his shirt dark as he swung, the rhythm steady but his eyes distant, lost in something he wouldn't name. Footprints, he grunted, not looking up, the axe biting into the wood with a spray of splinters that scattered like brittle bones across the dirt. All around Tanner's place, both houses, bare feet, circling like she was pacing us, stalking us, led up into the mountains, disappearing into the rocks. Bare feet, I choked out, my voice cracking like dry twigs underfoot, disbelief warring with a cold dread that sank into my bones. On this ground, that's nuts. Nobody walks barefoot out here, not with the thorns and stones. He swung again, the thud reverberating in my chest, a heavy pulse that matched the growing unease twisting inside me. Tell that to the dirt. She didn't trip, didn't falter, just walked, like the rocks were nothing, like she didn't feel them. Prints were deep too deep for some old hag. The day slogged on, the heat a relentless fist pounding down on us, the air thick with dust and a faint, sour stench, like something decaying just out of sight, a whiff of rot that teased my nose with every breath. We were tasked with gathering kindling that afternoon. Me and Amma, trudging along a trail by the new house, snapping brittle sticks that cracked like brittle bones in our hands, the sound sharp and hollow in the heavy air. The forest loomed on either side, its shadows shifting as the sun sank, stretching long and thin across the ground like fingers reaching for us. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back, unseen, unblinking, boring into me with a weight that made my shoulders hunch. A rustle snapped through the brush, sharp and close, just beyond the fence. A sound like something heavy dragging through the undergrowth. Amma froze, her stick slipping to the ground with a clatter that echoed too loudly, her eyes wide as moons, glinting with a fear I felt mirrored in my own chest. "Dear," I muttered, forcing a grin that felt more like a grimace, my throat dry as ash, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. The air buzzed, a low vibration I felt in my teeth, a hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, and we bolted back, kindling spilling from our arms as we ran, the sticks tumbling to the dirt like offerings to whatever watched us. My legs burned, my breath rasping as we stumbled into the yard, the heat pressing down harder, the sour stench thicker now, clinging to my skin like a second shadow. That night, Aunt Winona swore she saw a figure at the fence, thought it was a neighbor dropping by, her voice bright with false hope as she called out, But when no answer came, it melted into the dark like smoke, leaving her pale and trembling. She banned us from wandering alone after that, her voice a whisper as she muttered about things that watch, things that wait, her eyes darting to the windows like she expected them to shatter. The third night, I couldn't sleep, the cot creaking beneath me as I tossed, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and fear. I caught Tanner and Mom in the kitchen, their voices low and taut, slipping through the walls like venomous threads, each word laced with a weight that made my stomach twist. "It's not new," Tanner said, her words heavy with years of knowing, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Years ago, an old woman, skulking near windows, muttering things no one should hear, curses maybe, or names from the other side. The mountains hold them, spirits that thrive on fear, on isolation, on the cracks in your mind. If she's back, she's brought something with her, something worse." I flattened myself against the wall, breath shallow, the smell of burned coffee and sage stinging my nose as it drifted from their cups, a bitter tang that mixed with the sour rot lingering in the air. Spirits, that was old folks' talk, tales to keep us from sneaking out, stories I'd laughed off as a kid with a smug certainty that I knew better. But Tanner's trembling hands as she clutched her mug, Mom's darting eyes scanning the dark beyond the window, they made it real, sinking into me like a cold blade, sharp and unyielding. Sleep was a lost cause after that, the old house shrinking around me, the walls pressing in with a creak that sounded too much like a groan, the barred windows a trap that held me captive. Winona stayed up, reading by lantern light, her shadow flickering on the wall like a restless spectre, jagged and distorted in the dim glow. Around midnight, she hissed my name, her voice a tight wire snapping under strain. Scratching, outside. "Listen." I bolted upright, ears straining, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And there it was, slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across metal. A sound that clawed at my nerves with a relentless, scraping rhythm. It was sharp, insistent, cutting through the silence like a blade through skin. And Winona snuffed the lantern with a quick puff, plunging us into black, the sudden darkness thick and suffocating. She pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass in short, panicked bursts and whispered. Saw it, limping off, stringy hair silver in the moonlight, moving like it didn't care we were here. "Coyote," I said, but the word tasted like bile. My mouth parched, the lie crumbling as it left my lips. She didn't reply, just sank back onto her cot, eyes wide and unblinking, the dread pinning her like a weight, her usual boldness stripped away by the night. I felt it too, a heaviness pressing on my chest, squeezing the air out until every breath was a struggle. Cheeto took over night watch after that, pacing the yard with a flashlight and Tanner's old hunting rifle, its barrel glinting coldly in the moonlight, a silent promise of protection that felt flimsy against the dark. Uncle Snay burned herbs around the perimeter, the smoke thick and acrid, a pungent cloud that stung my eyes and throat as it seeped through the cracks, its bitter scent mixing with the rot that seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour. The days blurred into a haze of heat and tension, the sun a merciless tyrant beating down on us, its glare reflecting off the dry earth in waves that shimmered like a mirage. The sour stench was everywhere now, a constant undercurrent that coated my tongue with every breath, a taste of decay that no amount of water could wash away. We moved through our chores like ghosts, gathering water from a creaking well, stacking firewood that splintered under our hands, each task a distraction from the growing unease that gnawed at us. The mountains watched, their peaks cutting into the sky like teeth, their shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped lower, a slow, deliberate advance that mirrored the dread creeping through my veins. I caught glimpses of the adults exchanging looks, sharp, silent conversations that spoke of secrets they wouldn't share, their faces etched with lines of worry that deepened with every passing hour. The fourth night brought a new terror. I was restless, pacing the old house, the floorboards groaning under my feet with a sound that grated like a scream. The air was heavier than ever, thick with the stench of rot and something metallic, like blood pooling just out of sight. I stopped by the window, peering through the bars, the moon a faint sliver casting a weak, trembling light over the yard. That's when I saw it, a shape, hunched and limping, moving along the fence line with a slow, deliberate gait. Stringy hair glinted silver, swaying with each step. And for a moment, I thought I saw her turn, her pale face catching the moonlight, eyes too large, too bright, staring straight at me. My breath caught, a sharp gasp that burned my lungs, and I stumbled back, the cot creaking as I crashed into it. The scratching came again, louder this time, a relentless scrape that echoed through the walls, a sound that seemed to claw its way inside my skull. "Winona," I hissed, my voice barely a whisper, but she was already awake, her lantern flickering back to life as she leapt to her feet. "It's her. She's out there." She didn't argue, didn't question, just grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to bruise, and we pressed against the window, the bars cold and unyielding against our faces. The shape was gone, swallowed by the dark, but the scratching didn't stop, moving from the wall to the door, a slow, taunting rhythm that made my skin crawl. Cheeto's flashlight beam swept the yard outside, his silhouette tense as he paced, the rifle clutched in his hands like a lifeline. The herbs burned stronger now, the smoke a choking haze that filled the house, its acrid bite searing my lungs as I coughed, tears streaming down my face. The last night broke us completely, shattering whatever fragile calm we'd clung to. Saya was in the new house, stirring a pot of beans over a flickering stove, the air thick with the smell of cumin and grease, a fleeting comfort against the dark. Then she screamed, a short, piercing cry that sliced through the chatter like a gunshot, freezing us all in place. She'd seen it, a pale hand gripping the bars, fingers twisted and long, nails black and jagged, clinging to the metal before it vanished with a speed that defied reason. The pot crashed to the floor, beans spilling across the wood like blood, dark and glistening in the lantern light, and we rushed in, flashlights sweeping the dark with frantic arcs. Nothing, except muddy handprints smearing the wall beneath the window, trailing downward in long, uneven streaks, like something had clung there, staring in with a hunger we couldn't fathom. We barely spoke, our breaths shallow and quick as we searched, the beams of light trembling in our hands. The handprints were cold to the touch, the mud still damp, a sickly brown that smeared on my fingers as I brushed them, the stench of rot rising sharp and nauseating from the stain. Cheeto cursed under his breath, his voice a low growl as he swung the rifle toward the dark, his flashlight beam cutting through the night like a blade, searching for a target that refused to show itself. Aunt Winona clutched Lona to her chest, her face pale as death, her whispers a frantic prayer that stumbled over itself, words tripping into a jumbled plea for protection. Dawn broke with a cruel slowness, the grey light seeping through the haze, revealing more than we wanted to see. Footprints, fresh and uneven, weaving from the new house into the scrub, up toward the foothills in a jagged path that mocked our fear. Uncle Snay traced them with us trailing behind, his face grim as he pointed to patches of disturbed earth. clumps of dirt torn up like something had dragged its feet, or something heavier, something it carried. The tracks were deep, too deep for an old woman, too deliberate for a wandering animal, and they stretched into the distance, disappearing into the rocks where the mountains swallowed them whole. "We stop here," Tana snapped, her voice a thunderclap that brooked no argument, her eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen. "Some places feed on fear. You don't go looking. You don't give it what it wants." We left early, piling into the trucks, with a haste that bordered on panic. The kids too shaken to protest, the adults too tense to explain. Their silence a wall we couldn't breach. The drive was hours of jolting roads, the tires rumbling over ruts that jarred my bones, the mountains fading in the rear view like a nightmare retreating into the haze. But their shadow lingered, heavy and cold, a weight that pressed on my chest even as the distance grew. The cab reeked of sweat and dust, a sour miasma that clung to my skin. My sisters whispering about Hosa's scream in hushed, trembling tones, their words barely audible over the engine's growl. My hands gripped the seat, knuckles white, every bump jolting that pale hand back into my mind, its twisted fingers etched into my vision like a brand. The road stretched on, endless and unforgiving, the scrub blurring past in a monotonous dance of brown and grey, the air thick with the dust kicked up by our tires, a gritty haze that stung my eyes and coated my tongue. I stared out the window, the mountains shrinking but never fully gone, their peaks still cutting into the sky like a promise of return. My cousins sat silent, their usual chatter replaced by a stillness that mirrored the land. Empty, watchful, waiting. I caught Mom's reflection in the side mirror, her face drawn, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But every so often, they'd flick to the rear view, as if she expected something to rise from the dust behind us, something pale and limping, its silver hair glinting in the sun. Years later, I asked Mom why they believed Hosa so fast, why they didn't dismiss it as a kid's wild imagination. She sighed, her eyes distant, lost in a memory she'd rather forget. "It's not new," she said, her voice low, heavy with the weight of truth. "Elders say a spirit roams those peaks, takes an old woman's shape, watches through windows, feeds on the weak, on the fear you can't hide. Footprints everywhere mean it's real, mean it's been here before, and it'll come again." I don't go back much now, the pull of that land a faint echo I try to ignore. When I do, I stay in the old house, windows sealed tight, the air thick with memory, a stale weight that presses on my lungs. Relatives still whisper of a pale figure prowling during gatherings, especially when we're distracted, their voices low and tense as they recount sightings. Shapes in the dark, hands at the windows, scratches that linger in the silence. The heat still presses, a relentless fist that never relents. The dark still hums with that low, ominous pulse. And sometimes, half awake in the dead of night, I hear that scratching, faint, insistent, a slow drag of nails that seems to call my name, waiting for me to look. I won't, because out there, under the shadow of those mountains, something wears a face just to remind us it's never full. Its hunger a bottomless void that gnaws at the edges of our lives, patient and eternal. And there it is, the last echo fading into the void, the final shadow slinking back into the dark where it belongs. For now, the reservation roads of the LDS lands, with their sprinting horrors and glowing eyes, left us clutching our prayers in the flickering firelight. Those Phoenix streets, where a white-faced nightmare turned a quiet drive into a dance with death, still hum in the back of my mind, a tune I can't unhear. And down in Kikapoo country, Under those ancient, hungering mountains, the pale figure with her twisted smile lingers like a stain on the soul. Her scratch is a lullaby no one wants to sleep to. 3 stories, 3 nights, 3 places where the dark isn't just a backdrop. It's a player, a predator, a promise that what you can't see is always worse than what you can. These aren't just tales to shrug off with a laugh and a beer. They're warnings carved into the night itself, etched in the dust of forgotten roads, the silence of empty streets, the whispers of old houses. Jake's haunted stare, the driver's trembling hands, the kid's wide-eyed terror. They're all threads in the same twisted tapestry, proof that the world we know is just a thin skin stretched over something older, something hungrier, out there, beyond the headlights, past the fences, under the mountains it waits, patient, relentless, grinning in the dark. And the kicker? We'll never know what it really wants, not until it's too late. So next time you're out in the night, alone with the hum of your engine or the creak of your floorboards, listen close. That rustle, that tap, that faint whistle, it's not the wind, it's the dark, reminding you it's still got room at the table. That's all for tonight, you sleepless fiends. But the nightmares don't stop here. If these stories have sunk their claws into you, and I bet they have, hit that subscribe button and join the Twisted family at No Sleep Nightmares Reddit. We're a crew that thrives on the shadows, and we're not done yet. Drop a comment below. Tell us which of these horrors crawled under your skin the deepest, or share your own brush with the unknown. Did you see something on a lonely road? Hear a scratch that wasn't there? Your tales keep this fire burning, and I'm dying to read them. Like the video if you're still awake, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next time we peel back the night's skin. Sleep tight, if you can, because out there, in the places we've been tonight, the dark's still watching, and it knows your name.